The Case of the Perfect Maid by Agatha Christie. Read by Matthew Jones.
Oh, if you please, madam, could I speak to you a moment?
It might be thought this request was in the nature of an absurdity, since Edna, Miss Marple's little maid, was actually speaking to her mistress at the moment. Recognising the idiom, however, Miss Marple said promptly,
"Certainly, Edna. Come in and shut the door. What is it?"
Obediently shutting the door, Edna advanced into the room, pleated the corner of her apron between her fingers, and swallowed once or twice.
"Yes, Edna?" Please, ma'am, it's my cousin Gladys."
"Dear me," said Miss Marple, her mind leaping to the worst, and, alas, the most usual conclusion.
"Not in trouble?"
Edna hastened to reassure her.
"Oh, no, ma'am, nothing of that kind. Gladys not that kind of girl. It's just that she's upset. You see, she's lost her place."
"Oh, dear, I am sorry to hear that. She was at Old Hall, wasn't she, with the Mrs. Skinner?"
"Yes, ma'am, that's right, ma'am, and Gladys very upset about it, very upset indeed." "Gladys has changed places rather often before, though, hasn't she?" "Oh, yes, ma'am, she's always one for a change, Gladys is. She never seems to get really settled, if you know what I mean, but she's always the one to give notice."
"And this time it's the other way around?" asked Miss Marple dryly.
"Yes, ma'am, and it upset Gladys something awful."
Miss Marple looked slightly surprised. Her recollection of Gladys, who had occasionally come to drink tea in the kitchen on her days out, was a stout, giggling girl of unshakable equable temperament.
"You see, ma'am, it's the way it happened, the way Miss Skinner looked."
"How," inquired Miss Marple patiently, "did Miss Skinner look?" This time Edna got well away with her news bulletin.
"Ah, ma'am, it was ever such a shock to Gladys. You see, one of Miss Emily's brooches was missing, and such a hue and cry for it as never was, and of course nobody likes a thing like that to happen. I mean, it's upsetting, ma'am, if you know what I mean. And Gladys helped search everywhere, and there was Miss Lavinia saying she was going to the police about it, and then it turned up again, pushed right to the back of a drawer in the dressing-table. Very thankful Gladys was. And the very next day as ever was, a plate got broken, and Miss Lavinia, she bounced out right away, and she told Gladys to take a month's notice. And what Gladys feels is it couldn't have been the plate, and that Miss Lavinia was just making an excuse of that, and that it was because of the brooch, and they think she did take it and put it in the back of a drawer when the police was mentioned. Gladys wouldn't do such a thing, never she wouldn't. And what she feels is it will get around and tell against her. It's a very serious thing for a girl, as you know, ma'am."
Miss Marple nodded, though having no particular liking for the bouncing, self-opinionated Gladys. She was quite sure of the girl's intrinsic honesty, and could well imagine that the affair must have upset her.
"I suppose, ma'am, there isn't nothing you could do about it. Gladys in ever such a taking." "Well, tell her not to be silly. If she didn't take the brooch, which I'm sure she did not, then she has no cause to be upset. It'll get about. I am going up that way this afternoon. I'll have a word with the Mrs. Skinner." "Oh, thank you, madam."
Old Hall was a big Victorian house, surrounded by woods and parkland. Since it had proved unlettable and unsaleable as it was, an enterprising speculator had divided it into 4 flats, with a central hot water system, and the use of the grounds to be held in common by the tenants. The experiment had been satisfactory. A rich and eccentric old lady and her maid occupied one flat. The old lady had a passion for birds, and entertained a feathered gathering to meals every day. A retired Indian judge and his wife rented a second. A very young couple, recently married, occupied the third, and the fourth had been taken only 2 months ago by the 2 maiden ladies of the name of Skinner. The 4 sets of tenants were only on the most distant terms with each other, since none of them had anything in common. The landlord had been heard to say that this was an excellent thing. What he dreaded were friendships, followed by estrangements, and subsequent complaints to him. Miss Marple was acquainted with all the tenants, though she knew none of them well. The elder Miss Skinner, Miss Lavinia, was what might be termed the working member of the firm. Miss Emily, the younger, spent most of her time in bed, suffering from various complaints which, in the opinion of St. Mary Mead, were largely imaginary. Only Miss Lavinia believed devoutly in her sister's martyrdom and patience under affliction, and willingly ran errands and trotted up and down to the village for things that my sister had suddenly fancied. It was the view of St. Mary Mead that if Miss Emily suffered half as much as she said she did, she would have sent for Dr. Haydock long ago. But Miss Emily, when this was hinted to her, shut her eyes in a superior way, and murmured that her case was not a simple one. The best specialists in London had been baffled by it, and that a wonderful new man had put her on a most revolutionary course of treatment, and that she really hoped her health would improve under it. No humdrum GP could possibly understand her case. "And it's my opinion," said the outspoken Miss Hartnell, "that she's very wise not to send for him. Dear Dr. Haydock, in that breezy manner of his, would tell her that there was nothing the matter with her, and she should get up and not make a fuss. It would do her a lot of good." Failing such arbitrary treatment, however, Miss Emily continued to lie on sofas, to surround herself with strange little pill-boxes, and to reject nearly everything that had been cooked for her, and to ask for something else, usually something difficult and inconvenient to get. The door was opened to Miss Marple by Gladdy, looking more depressed than Miss Marple had ever thought possible. In the sitting-room, a quarter of the late drawing-room, which had been partitioned into a dining-room, drawing-room, bathroom, and housemaid's cupboard, Miss Lavinia rose to greet Miss Marple. Lavinia Skinner was a tall, gaunt, bony female of 50. She had a gruff voice and an abrupt manner. "Nice to see you. Emily's lying down, feeling low today, poor dear. Hope she'll see you. It'd cheer her up. But there are times when she doesn't feel up to seeing anyone. Oh, poor dear, she's wonderfully patient." Miss Marple responded politely. Servants were the main topic of conversation in St. Mary Mead, so it was not difficult to lead the conversation in that direction. Miss Marple said she'd heard that that nice girl, Gladys Holmes, was leaving. Miss Lavinia nodded. "Wednesday week. Broke things, you know. Can't have that." Miss Marple sighed, and said we all had to put up with things nowadays. It was so difficult to get girls to come to the country. Did Miss Skinner really think it was wise to part with Gladys? "I know it's difficult to get servants. The Devereuxs haven't got anybody. But then I don't wonder. Always quarrelling, jazz on all night, and meals at any time. That girl knows nothing of housekeeping. I pity her husband. Then the Larkins have just lost their maid. Of course, that was the judge's Indian temper, and him wanting chota hazri, or whatever he calls it, at 6 in the morning. And Mrs. Larkin always fussing. I don't wonder at that either. Mrs. Carmichael Janet is a fixture, of course, though in my opinion she is a most disagreeable woman. Absolutely bullies the old lady. Then you don't think you might reconsider your decision about Gladys? She really is a nice girl. I know all her family. Very honest and superior." "I've got my reasons." "You Mr. Brooch, I understand." "Oh, well now, who's been talking? I suppose the girl has. Quite frankly, I'm almost certain she took it, and then she got frightened and put it back, but of course one can't say anything unless one is sure. Oh, do come and see Emily, Miss Marple. I'm sure it'll do her good." Miss Marple followed meekly to where Miss Lavinia knocked on a door, was bidden enter, and ushered her guest into the best room in the flat. It had most of the light, which was excluded by half-drawn blinds. Miss Emily was lying in bed, apparently enjoying the half-gloom and her own indefinite sufferings. The dim light showed her to be a thin, indecisive-looking creature, with a good deal of greyish-yellow hair untidily wound round her head and erupting into curls, the whole thing looking like a bird's nest of which no respecting bird could be proud. There was a smell in the room of eau de cologne, and stale biscuits, and camphor. With half-closed eyes and a thin, weak voice, Emily Skinner explained that this was one of her bad days. "The worst of ill health is that one knows what a burden it is to everyone around one. Lavinia is very good to me. Lavvy, dear, I do so hate giving trouble, but if my hot water bottle could only be filled in the way I like it, too full it weighs on me so, Miss Marple. On the other hand, if not sufficiently filled, it gets cold immediately." "Oh, I'm sorry, dear. Give it to me. I'll empty a little out." "Well, perhaps, if you're doing that, it might be refilled. There are no rusks in the house, I suppose?" "Oh, no, it doesn't matter. I can do without. Some weak tea and a slice of lemon. Oh,
No lemons. Oh, then no, I couldn't really drink tea without lemon. I think the milk was slightly turned this morning. It has put me against milk in my tea, Miss Marple. It doesn't matter. I can do without tea. Only I do feel so weak. You know they say oysters are nourishing. I wonder if I could fancy a few. Oh, no, it's too much bother to get hold of them so late in the day. I can fast until tomorrow.
Lavinia left the room muttering something incoherent about bicycling down to the village. Miss Emily smiled feebly at her guest and remarked that she did hate giving anyone any trouble. Miss Marple told Edna that evening that she was afraid her embassy had met with no success. She was rather troubled to find the rumours as to Gladys's dishonesty were already going around the village. In the post office, Miss Weatherby tackled her.
My dear Jane, they gave her a written reference saying she was willing and sober and respectable, but saying nothing about honesty. That seems to me most significant. I hear that there was some trouble about a brooch. I think there must be something in it, you know, because one doesn't let a servant go nowadays unless it's something rather grave. They'll find it most difficult to get anyone else. Girls simply will not go to Old Hall. They're nervous coming home on their days out. You'll see, the Skinners won't find anyone else. And then perhaps that dreadful hypochondriac sister will have to get up and do something.
Great was the chagrin of the village when it was made known that the Mrs. Skinner had engaged, from an agency, a new maid who, by all accounts, was a perfect paragon.
A 3 years reference recommending her most warmly. She prefers the country, actually asks less wages than Gladys.
I think we've been very fortunate.
Well, really,
said Miss Marple, to whom these details were imparted by Miss Lavinia in the fishmonger's shop.
It does seem too good to be true.
It then became the opinion of St. Mary Mead that the paragon would cry off at the last minute and fail to arrive. None of these prognostications came true, however, and the village was able to observe the domestic treasure, by name Mary Higgins, driving through the village in Reed's taxi to Old Hall. It had to be admitted that her appearance was good. A most respectable-looking woman, very neatly dressed. When Miss Marple next visited Old Hall, on the occasion of recruiting stall-holders for the vicarage fete, Mary Higgins opened the door. She was certainly a most superior-looking maid. At a guess 40 years of age, with neat black hair, rosy cheeks, a plump figure, discreetly arrayed in black, with a white apron and cap.
Quite the good old-fashioned type of servant,
Miss Marple explained afterwards, and with the proper inaudible respectful voice, so different from the loud but adenoidal accents of Gladys. Miss Lavinia was looking far less harassed than usual, and, although she regretted that she could not take a stall owing to her preoccupation with her sister, she nevertheless tendered a handsome monetary contribution, and promised to produce a consignment of pen-wipers and babies' socks. Miss Marple commented on her air of well-being.
I really feel I owe a great deal to Mary. I am so thankful I had the resolution to get rid of that other girl. Mary's invaluable, cooks nicely and waits beautifully, and keeps our little flat scrupulously clean. Mattresses turned over every day, and she's really wonderful with Emily.
Miss Marple hastily inquired after Emily.
Oh, poor dear, she's been very much under the weather lately. She can't help it, of course, but it really makes things a little difficult sometimes. Wanting certain things cooked, and then, when they come, saying she can't eat now, and then wanting them again half an hour later, and everything spoiled and having to be done again. It makes, of course, a lot of work, but fortunately Mary does not seem to mind at all. She's used to waiting on invalids. She understands them, she says. It's such a comfort. Dear me, you are fortunate. Yes, indeed. I really feel Mary has been sent to us as the answer to prayer. She sounds to me almost too good to be true. I should be a little careful if I were you.
Lavinia Skinner failed to perceive the point of this remark.
Oh, I assure you I do all I can to make her comfortable. I don't know what I should do if she left. I don't expect she'll leave until she's ready to leave.
Miss Marple stared very hard at her hostess. Miss Lavinia said,
If one has no domestic worries, it takes such a lot off one's mind, doesn't it? How is your little Edna shaping?
Oh, she's doing very nicely.
Not much head, of course, not like your Mary. Still, I do know all about Edna, because she's a village girl.
As she went out into the hall, she heard the invalid's voice fretfully raised.
The compress, it's been allowed to get dry. Dr. Allerton particularly said moisture continually renewed. Oh, leave it. I want a cup of tea and a boiled egg. Boiled only 3 minutes and a half, remember, and send Miss Lavinia to me.
The efficient Mary emerged from the bedroom, and saying to Lavinia,
"Miss Emily's asking for you, madam,"
proceeded to open the door for Miss Marple, helping her into her coat and handing her her umbrella in the most irreproachable fashion. Miss Marple took the umbrella, dropped it, tried to pick it up, and dropped her bag, which flew open. Mary politely retrieved various odds and ends, a handkerchief, an engagement book, an old-fashioned leather purse, 2 shillings 3 pennies, and a striped piece of peppermint rock. Miss Marple received the last with some signs of confusion.
"Oh, dear! Oh, that must have been Mrs. Clement's little boy. He was sucking it, I remember. He took my bag to play with, and he must have put it inside. Oh, it's terribly sticky, isn't it? Shall I take it, madam? Oh, would you? Thank you so much."
Mary stooped to retrieve the last item, a small mirror, upon recovering which Miss Marple exclaimed fervently,
"Oh, how lucky I am it isn't broken."
She thereupon departed, Mary standing politely by the door, holding a piece of striped rock, with a completely expressionless face. For 10 days longer St. Mary Mead had to endure hearing of the excellencies of Miss Lavinia's and Miss Emily's treasure. On the 11th day, the village awoke to its big thrill. Mary the Paragon was missing. Her bed had not been slept in, and the front door was found ajar. She had slipped out quietly during the night. And not Mary alone was missing. 2 brooches and 5 rings of Miss Lavinia's, 3 rings, a pendant, a bracelet, and 4 brooches of Miss Emily's were missing too. It was the beginning of a chapter of catastrophe. Young Mrs. Devereux had lost her diamonds, which she kept in an unlocked drawer, and also some valuable furs given to her as a wedding present. The judge and his wife also had jewellery taken, and a certain amount of money. Mrs. Carmichael was the greatest sufferer. Not only had she some very valuable jewels, but she also kept in the flat a large sum of money. Both were gone. It had been Janet's evening out, and her mistress was in the habit of walking around the gardens at dusk, calling to the birds and scattering crumbs. It seemed clear that Mary, the perfect maid, had had keys to fit all the flats. There was, it must be confessed, a certain amount of ill-natured pleasure in St. Mary Mead. Miss Lavinia had boasted so much of her marvellous Mary.
"And all the time, my dear, just a common thief."
Interesting revelations followed. Not only had Mary disappeared into the blue, but the agency who had provided and vouched for her credentials was alarmed to find that the Mary Higgins who had applied to them, and whose references they had taken up, to all intents and purposes never existed. It was the name of a bona fide servant who had lived with the bona fide sister of a dean. The real Mary Higgins was existing peacefully in a place in Cornwall. "Damned clever, the whole thing," Inspector Slack was forced to admit. "And if you ask me, that woman works with a gang. There was a case of much the same kind in Northumberland a year ago. Stuff was never traced, and they never caught her. However, we will do better than that in Much Benham." Inspector Slack was always a confident man. Nevertheless, weeks passed, and Mary Higgins remained triumphantly at large. In vain Inspector Slack redoubled that energy that so belied his name. Miss Lavinia remained tearful. Miss Emily was so upset and felt so alarmed by her condition that she actually sent for Dr. Haydock. The whole of the village was terribly anxious to know what he thought of Miss Emily's claims to ill health, but naturally could not ask him. Satisfactory data came to hand on the subject, however, through Mr. Meek, the chemist's assistant. He was walking out with Clara, Mrs. Price Ridley's maid. It was then known that Dr. Haydock had prescribed valerian, which, according to Mr. Meek, was the stock remedy for malingerers in the army. Soon afterwards it was learned that Miss Emily, not relishing the medical attention she had had, was declaring that in the state of her health she felt it was her duty to be near the specialist in London who understood her case. It was, she said, only fair to Lavinia. The flat was put up for subletting. It was a few days after that Miss Marple, rather pink and flustered, called at the police station in Much Benham and asked for Inspector Slack. Inspector Slack did not like Miss Marple, but he was aware that the Chief Constable, Colonel Melchett, did not share that opinion. Rather grudgingly, therefore, he received her. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple. What can I do for you?"
"Oh dear, I'm afraid you're in a hurry."
"Lots of work on, but I can spare a few moments."
"Oh dear, I hope I shall be able to put what I want to say properly. It's so difficult to explain yourself, you know, don't you think? Oh, well, no, perhaps you don't. But you see, not having been educated in the modern style, just a governess, you know, who taught one the dates of the kings of England and general knowledge, Dr. Brewer, 3 kinds of disease of wheat, blight, mildew. Oh, now what was the third? Was it smut?"
"Do you want to talk about smut?" asked Inspector Slack, and then blushed.
"Oh, no, no."
Miss Marple hastily disclaimed any wish to talk about smut.
"It's just an illustration, you know. And how needles are made, all that sort of thing. Discursive, you know, but not teaching one to keep to the point. Oh, which is what I want to do. Now let me see. Oh, yes, it's about Miss Skinner's maid, Gladys, you know."
"Mary Higgins."
Yes, the second maid, but it's Gladys Holmes, I mean. Rather an impertinent girl, far too pleased with herself, but really strictly honest. It's so important that should be recognised."
"Well, there's no charge against her as far as I know."
"No, I know there isn't a charge, but that makes it worse, because you see people go on thinking things. Oh dear, I knew I should explain this badly. What I really mean is that the important thing is to find Mary Higgins."
"Well, certainly. Have you any ideas on that subject?"
"Well, as a matter of fact, I have. May I ask you a question? Are fingerprints of no use to you?"
"Ah, well, that's where she was a bit too artful for us. Did most of her work in rubber gloves or housemaid's gloves. And she'd been careful. Wiped off everything in her bedroom and on the sink. Couldn't find a single fingerprint in the place."
"If you did have fingerprints, would it help?"
"It might, madam. They may be known at the yard. This isn't her first job, I'd say."
Miss Marple nodded brightly. She opened her bag and extracted a small cardboard box. Inside it, wedged in cotton wool, was a small mirror. "From my handbag. The maid's prints are on it. I think they should be satisfactory. She touched an extremely sticky substance a moment previously."
Inspector Slack stared. "Did you get her fingerprints on purpose?"
"Of course."
"You suspected her, then?"
"Well, you know, it did strike me that she was a little too good to be true. I practically told Miss Lavinia so, but she simply wouldn't take the hint. I'm afraid, you know, Inspector, that I don't believe in paragons. Most of us have our faults, and domestic service shows them up very quickly."
"Well," said Inspector Slack, recovering his balance, "I am obliged to you, I'm sure. We'll send these up to the yard and see what they've got." He stopped. Miss Marple had put her head a little on one side and was regarding him with a good deal of meaning.
"You wouldn't consider, I suppose, Inspector, looking a little nearer home?"
"What do you mean, Miss Marple?"
"It's very difficult to explain, but when you come across a peculiar thing you notice it, although often peculiar things may be the merest trifles. I have felt that all along, you know, about Gladys and the brooch, I mean. She is an honest girl. She wouldn't take that brooch. So why did Miss Skinner think she did? Miss Skinner is not a fool, far from it. Why was she so anxious to let a girl go who was a good servant when servants are hard to get? It was peculiar, you know. So I wondered a good deal. And I noticed another peculiar thing. Miss Emily is a hypochondriac, but she's the first hypochondriac who hasn't sent for some doctor or other at once. Hypochondriacs love doctors. Miss Emily didn't."
"What are you suggesting, Miss Marple?"
"Well, I'm suggesting, you know, that Miss Lavinia and Miss Emily are peculiar people. Miss Emily spends nearly all her time in a dark room, and if that hair of hers isn't a wig I'll eat my own switch. But what I say is this. It's perfectly possible for a thin, pale, grey-haired, whining woman to be the same as a black-haired, rosy-cheeked, plump woman, and nobody that I can find ever saw Miss Emily and Mary Higgins at one and the same time." Plenty of time to get impressions of all the keys. Plenty of time to find out all about the other tenants. Then get rid of the local girl. Miss Emily takes a brisk walk across country one night and arrives at the station as Mary Higgins next day. And then, at the right moment, Mary Higgins disappears, and off goes the hue and cry after her. I shall tell you where you will find her, Inspector. On Miss Emily Skinner's sofa. Get her fingerprints if you don't believe me, but you will find that I'm right. A couple of clever thieves, that's what the Skinners are, and no doubt in league with a clever post and rails, or fence, or whatever they call it. But they won't get away with it this time. I am not going to have one of our village girls' characters for honesty taken away like that. Gladys Holmes is as honest as the day, and everybody is going to know it. Good afternoon.
Miss Marple had stalked out before Inspector Slack had recovered. "Phew," he muttered. "I wonder if she's right." He soon found out that Miss Marple was right again. Colonel Melchett congratulated Slack on his efficiency, and Miss Marple had Gladys come to tea with Edna, and spoke to her seriously on settling down in a good situation when she next got one.